many people remember the farm workers movement that took place many years ago, particularly in California, but it certainly affected a lot of the Southwest. We had the Bracero Program, and it was a chance really for, and at that time the union was forming, the Farm Workers Union, and the United Farm Workers, and became a very pivotal part of the fight for workers' rights. Some people are doing kind of a parallel to the immigration movement that's going on right now. We are going to be talking today to Barbara Rhine, who was a legal counsel and represented the American Farm Workers Union there in California. Also has written a new book called Tell No Lies, which is a novel, but it's kind of based on the doings that took place in the San Joaquin Valley. Barbara, it's good to have you with us today on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was a time that certainly it was another generation, but I remember growing up watching all of it because I was in Los Angeles at that time, and there were a lot of rights, and Cesar Chavez was very front and center in this, and I'm sure it was a volatile time as well, as you probably remember it that way as well.
Oh, I definitely do. I was a staff attorney with the United Farm Workers Union from 1973 to 1975, which were the years of the biggest agricultural strike in the history of California. And it rolled over into a larger movement that entailed boycotting Gallo wine and table grapes all over the world, really, certainly in America and even in Europe. And eventually that brought especially the grape growers to the table to negotiate. And eventually the whole thing resulted in the passage of something called the Agricultural Labor Relations Act, which meant for the first time in history that farm workers had the right to organize a union. And it also resulted in substantive changes in the fields like bathrooms and water, some of the basics, so while you're working a long hot day. So it was a thrilling time to be out there.
When did the Bracero Program end? Was that after that, or because I don't remember?
I think the Bracero Program had ended before that.
It did, okay.
And the Farm Workers Union opposed the Bracero Program because it was sort of a form of indentured servitude. People were brought across the border, controlled heavily, not paid very much, and then taken back across the border. So it served agribusiness very well, but it wasn't so good for the workers, and it certainly undercut the efforts to organize domestic farm workers who came from Mexico and other places.
Yeah, I remember I was in high school during the time that the strike was taking place, and there were a lot of the students went to the markets and picketed against buying grapes, a lot of those kind of things. So it really did be an impact, particularly for people in the West, I think. But is there a parallel now to what's going on with the immigration movement today? Do you see any parallels to that at all?
Well, it certainly had aspects that related to immigration. Back to your point about how significant it was out here, I really think it was California's version of the civil rights movement. And what I mean by that is that the impact of it and the participation spread far beyond the actual farm worker people, and people came from the city. I remember organizing lawyers to come out. We could get 40 lawyers by snapping our finger, come out and volunteer their time to work on the various injunctions and free speech issues and some criminal cases that came out of that time. And, we had all sorts of legal work. We established law offices up and down the valley. So, but speaking to your immigration issue, my novel, which is called Tell No Lies, and it's the story of a black fugitive from justice, a farm worker organizer, and a Berkeley feminist who get caught in a love triangle out in the San Joaquin Valley during one of the largest Cesar Chavez marches in history. So the march is like the backdrop of the action that involves trying to keep this guy safe who's been brought out there to hide out, and his whole life has been changed. As Danny Glover says, if you want to know what it's like to be on the run through no fault of your own, scared, and then in love, read this book. So that's the foreground. And the background is a march that I created. This is fiction. It's a march against a winery called Colonia Winery. And the organizing of that march entails trying to go to people everywhere. So some of the people out there are what we would now call, and were probably called then, coyotes. They're people who help illegal immigrants get across the border and work in the fields. The growers relied heavily on illegal immigrants in that time for their work and also for breaking the strike. so Cesar Chavez took the kind of anomalous position that really these illegal immigrants should not be allowed to come. And there was a period where the union actually called immigration to try to turn people in who were breaking the strike. That, in turn, was very controversial in the cities because there was growing up a big movement for Chicano, as the people call themselves, who are of Mexican descent in California, Chicano liberation, Chicano freedom, Chicano pride. And they believed that there should be an open border and there shouldn't be these lines in the first place. So it was a very interesting conflict there. I remember having to drive up to the Bay Area and talk to the National Lawyers Guild, which was a group of lawyers, still exists, into supporting that position, and there was a lot of controversy about it.
Yeah, sure.
And I think if we take the issues there and we can bring them right up to the modern day, and the same or a similar tension still exists. Those who believe that it's not fair to try to shut the border against people who, after all, their government once controlled these parts of California, and those who believe, for whatever reason, that it should be tightly controlled, and then the rest of us who are somewhere in between. But I think that if people read my novel, they're going to find an interesting meditation on that issue and dialogue. And, this is a page-turning novel. I don't mean to make it sound dry, like it's an analysis. It's actually a story, but it's got that in there.
Oh, great. What happened to the farm workers union? They had some scandals, did they not, that kind of tarnished what they did? And they don't seem to be as powerful as they once were.
Well, I'll tell you, I thought that too, but I started on a book tour. I launched my novel a couple of weeks ago at a bookstore in Oakland, and then I went on the road, and I'm going to go on the road again, and I'm going to go to Boston and New York and Chicago and L.A. and Sacramento. But where it started was a small town called Rhine, 25 miles east of Fresno, and Reedley has a peace group that has meetings every Friday night, and I was scheduled to come and read from the novel. They actually gave me an honorarium. That's never happened to me before, and we sold books, and the audience was very interesting because they were people my age, and I'm old enough to have written a novel that from times I experienced that's now called a historical novel. And these folks were from what we called out their small grower families. They weren't, in other words, scions of the huge companies, but their parents had owned some ranches and what they call pitted fruit, the peach trees and the plum trees and that sort of thing. And they remembered this dispute very well. One of their parents had recognized the Farm Workers Union and was immediately shunned by the community, and the wife had to quit her bridge club and that sort of thing. So then it was as though we're alive in the room right there. Should we even be talking about this? Should these workers get what they want? And it turns out there's a very current dispute involving one of the largest fruit farms in the country, where the Farm Workers Union has had passed enough signatures to get an election, got elected. The farm workers' position would be the growers aren't negotiating in good faith, and it's taking forever. And so, in other words, the Farm Workers Union is actually alive and well. A guy heads it named Arturo Rodriguez, and it's functioning, and it is administering contracts and gaining some new ones. Now, this guy, Arturo Rodriguez, doesn't have the charismatic presence that Cesar Chavez had. He's a regular guy, like maybe you and me are. And there have been some books come out about Cesar after his heyday and whether his leadership of the union was what it should have been. And they're very interesting. There was just a profile of Cesar Chavez and the movie in the New Yorker recently. And actually, if you look at my website, which is tellnoliesnovel.com, and go to the piece is about that movie, Cesar Chavez, what's good about it and what's not, in my opinion. So, yes, there's been controversy. It's still very alive out here. But I think that's a good thing because it keeps the memory of those days present in these days, and boy, the issues certainly have not gone away.
Well, very interesting. Well, Bob, I want to thank you for talking to us. Again, the book is called Tell No Lies, and the website is tellnoliesnovel.com. And thanks for taking us back.
Free ways to buy it on that website, and it could be inexpensive. So thanks so much for having me, Bob.
Well, very good, and kind of a parallel, I think, to the past and also the present. Thanks again for being with us.
You are welcome.